They say money can't buy happiness. But what happens when you lose everything? The empire you built, the woman you loved, and the life you thought would last forever. This is the story of Robert Castellano, a man who had it all, lost it all, and found something unexpected in the place he least expected, the unforgiving embrace of the wilderness. This isn't just a story about wealth and loss. It's about what remains when everything is stripped away. It's about a man's final choice when the world he knew crumbled to dust. And it begins, as so many great stories do, with a chance encounter that would change everything. 10 years ago, Robert Castellano stood at the pinnacle of the tech world. At 42 years old, he was the founder and CEO of NextGen Technologies, a software company that had revolutionized cloud computing infrastructure. His net worth exceeded $3 billion. His face graced the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time magazine. He had offices in 12 countries, employed over 15,000 people, and his company's stock was among the most sought after on the NASDAQ. But for all his success, Robert was alone. He worked 18-hour days. He slept in his office more often than his penthouse. His relationships were transactional: business dinners, networking events, board meetings. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a conversation that wasn't about quarterly earnings or market projections. His executive assistant, Margaret, had worked for him for 7 years and often remarked that she'd never seen him smile. Not really. Not the kind of smile that reaches your eyes and comes from somewhere deep inside. That changed on a Tuesday in October. Robert had a rare free afternoon. A canceled meeting had opened up 3 hours in his schedule. On a whim, something he rarely indulged, he decided to visit the Seattle Art Museum. He couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the autumn light filtering through his office windows, reminding him that a world existed beyond spreadsheets and strategy sessions. The museum was quiet that afternoon. Robert wandered through the contemporary wing, barely seeing the paintings, his mind still churning through the acquisition deal he'd been negotiating for months. Then he turned a corner and saw her. She stood before a massive abstract painting, her head tilted slightly, completely absorbed. She wore a simple cream-colored sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun. There was something about the way she stood, completely present, completely still, that made Robert stop in his tracks. He found himself walking toward her, drawn by something he couldn't name. "It's interesting, isn't it?" he said, immediately regretting how generic that sounded. She turned, and Robert felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were deep brown, intelligent, with small crinkles at the corners that suggested she smiled often. She was beautiful, but it wasn't just that. There was a warmth to her, an openness that seemed entirely foreign to Robert's world of calculated expressions and strategic conversations. "I've been standing here for 20 minutes, she said, smiling. "I can't decide if it's brilliant or if I'm completely missing the point." Robert laughed. He actually laughed. "I was thinking the same thing." Her name was Elena Martinez. She was 34, an elementary school teacher at a public school in the Beacon Hill neighborhood. She visited the museum every few weeks, she told him, whenever she needed to think or just wanted to see something beautiful. They talked for an hour. Then 2. Robert forgot about the emails piling up on his phone, forgot about the conference call he was supposed to join, forgot about everything except the woman standing beside him, gesturing animatedly as she described teaching her third graders about the solar system. She had no idea who he was. She didn't recognize his name. She didn't follow tech news or business journals. To Elena, he was just Robert, a slightly awkward man in an expensive suit who seemed to desperately need someone to talk to. When they finally left the museum, the sun was setting, painting the Seattle skyline in shades of orange and pink. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" Robert asked, feeling more nervous than he had during his first venture capital pitch. Elena smiled that warm, genuine smile. "I like that." The next 6 months were a revelation for Robert. Elena opened up a world he'd forgotten existed. She took him to neighborhood farmers markets on Saturday mornings. They cooked dinner together in her small apartment. Nothing fancy, just pasta or stir-fry, but shared with laughter and conversation. She introduced him to her friends, a diverse group of teachers, artists, and community organizers who cared nothing for wealth or status. For the first time in decades, Robert felt like a person rather than a position. Elena knew about his success, of course. It was impossible to hide once she Googled his name. But it didn't change how she treated him. She teased him about his workaholic tendencies. She challenged his assumptions. When he complained about difficult negotiations, she reminded him about her student whose family was facing eviction, or her colleague working 2 jobs to pay off student loans. She gave him perspective. Robert found himself changing. He started leaving the office at reasonable hours. He delegated more to his executive team. He spent weekends hiking with Elena in the Cascades, where cell service was spotty and the silence was profound. "You know what I love about you?" Elena said one evening as they sat on her apartment balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life. "You're finally becoming yourself. Not the CEO version. Just you." Robert took her hand. "You did that. You showed me who I could be." 14 months after they met, Robert proposed. Not with a flashy public display or an ostentatious ring, but quietly, during a walk on Alki Beach at sunset. Elena cried and said yes immediately. They married in a small ceremony 6 months later. Elena insisted on something simple, just family and close friends, held in a garden venue outside the city. Robert would have given her anything, but she wanted simplicity, authenticity, love. And for the first time in his life, Robert understood what those words truly meant. The first 3 years of marriage were, by Robert's estimation, the happiest of his life. They bought a home together. Not the mansion Robert's wealth could afford, but a comfortable house with a garden where Elena could grow vegetables. They traveled, but not to luxury resorts. Elena wanted to see the world the way real people saw it. Backpacking through Southeast Asia, volunteering at wildlife reserves in Costa Rica, teaching English to children in rural Morocco. Robert's business continued to thrive. He'd found balance, he thought. He could be a successful CEO and a present husband. He could build his company while building a life. Elena seemed happy. She continued teaching, though Robert encouraged her to quit if she wanted to. She refused. Teaching gave her purpose, she said. It kept her grounded. But looking back, Robert would wonder when things started to change. Was it gradual, or did he just fail to notice? Elena began spending more time with a new group of friends, people Robert didn't know well. Wealthy socialites, art collectors, the kind of people who measured success in assets and influence. She started mentioning luxury brands, expensive restaurants, exclusive events. "We should travel more comfortably," she said one evening. "Business class at least. You can afford it." "I thought you liked traveling the way we do," Robert replied, confused. "You said it was more authentic." Elena's expression flickered with something. Impatience? Annoyance? But then she smiled. "Of course. I just thought we could enjoy ourselves a little more." The changes were subtle at first. Designer clothes appeared in her closet. She hired an interior decorator to renovate their perfectly nice home. She began planning elaborate dinner parties with guest lists full of people Robert barely knew. When Robert expressed concern about the spending, Elena became defensive. "You're a billionaire, Robert. We can afford to live like one." "But that's not who we are," Robert protested. "That's not who you are," Elena corrected. "Maybe it's who I want to be." Robert told himself it was a phase. She'd remember what mattered. They'd find their way back to what they'd had. He was wrong. By year 5 of their marriage, Elena had transformed into someone Robert barely recognized. The woman who once found joy in simple Saturday mornings and home-cooked meals now spent her days shopping, lunching with society friends, and planning her next renovation project. She'd quit teaching, despite her earlier insistence that it gave her purpose. "I'm supporting your career now," she explained when Robert questioned the decision. "Managing our social obligations, maintaining our home. That's my contribution." But Robert felt increasingly like a wallet rather than a husband. Their conversations revolve around expenses, purchases, social events. The deep talks they used to have about life, meaning, and purpose had evaporated. The intimacy they'd shared faded. Elena was always too tired, too busy, too distracted. They slept in the same bed, but lived in different worlds. Robert threw himself back into work. If his marriage was failing, at least his company was succeeding. Next-gen technologies expanded into artificial intelligence and quantum computing. The board discussed going public again, which would multiply Robert's wealth exponentially. He tried to fix things. He suggested marriage counseling. Elena refused, claiming there was nothing wrong. He planned surprise getaways to places they'd loved before, the beach where he'd proposed, the mountains where they'd hiked. Elena complained about the accommodations, the food, the lack of luxury amenities. When did you become so materialistic? Robert asked one night after a particularly tense dinner. Elena's eyes flashed with anger. When did you become so judgmental? You have billions, Robert. Billions. And you want us to live like we're scraping by. What's the point of all that money if we don't enjoy it? I thought the point was us, Robert said quietly. I thought the point was what we had. What we had was nice when you were just another guy at a museum, Elena shot back. But you're not. You're Robert Castellano, billionaire CEO, and I'm your wife. I deserve to live accordingly. The woman Robert had fallen in love with, the warm, grounded elementary school teacher who found beauty in simple things, was gone. Or perhaps, he thought in his darkest moments, she'd never really existed. Perhaps he'd been so desperate for connection that he'd invented the person he wanted her to be. Robert discovered the affair by accident. He'd come home early from a business trip. Meetings in Tokyo had concluded faster than expected. He'd thought about calling Elena, but decided to surprise her instead. The house was quiet when he entered. Robert climbed the stairs toward their bedroom, already imagining how happy Elena would be to see him. He heard voices, laughter, and then sounds that made his blood run cold. Robert stood frozen in the hallway, his hand on the doorknob, unable to move, unable to breathe. He didn't open the door. He didn't need to. He knew. Robert walked back downstairs, got in his car, and drove. He didn't know where he was going. He just drove, his mind numb, his heart shattered. Hours later, he found himself at Alki Beach, where he'd proposed to Elena. The sun was setting, just like that evening 7 years ago when he believed in forever. He sat on the sand and wept. The man's name was Marcus Thornton, a venture capitalist Elena had met at one of her society luncheons. Robert had met him briefly at a charity gala. Handsome, charming, wealthy. The kind of man who collected beautiful things. When Robert finally confronted Elena, she didn't deny it. She didn't even seem particularly sorry. You're never here, she said coldly. You're married to your company. Marcus pays attention to me. He makes me feel special. I loved you, Robert said, his voice breaking. I gave you everything. You gave me money, Elena corrected. That's not the same thing. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. She was wrong, wasn't she? He had loved her. He had changed his entire life for her. But a small voice in his head whispered, had he? Really? Or had he just found a comfortable middle ground where he could keep his empire while pretending to have balance? Maybe they'd both been lying to themselves. Elena wanted a divorce. Robert, despite everything, wanted to try to save the marriage. But you can't save something when only one person is still fighting. I want what I deserve, Elena said during their first mediation session, her eyes hard. What followed was 18 months of the most brutal legal battle Robert had ever experienced. And that was saying something for a man who'd survived countless corporate wars. Elena's lawyers were vicious. They argued that she'd been instrumental in Robert's success, that she'd supported him, managed their household, facilitated important social connections. They claimed she deserved half of everything, not just community property, but half of Robert's entire fortune, including his company shares. Robert's attorneys assured him that such claims were absurd. Washington was a community property state, but Elena had no legitimate claim to assets Robert had acquired before their marriage. His next-gen technologies stock, his investments, his real estate holdings, most of it was protected. But Elena's legal team had done their homework. They'd found loopholes, technicalities. More importantly, they'd found leverage. During the marriage, Robert had made several financial moves that, while legal, could be portrayed poorly in court. Offshore accounts for legitimate tax purposes could be spun as hidden assets. Business restructurings could be framed as attempts to shield wealth from community property laws. And there was the prenuptial agreement, or rather, the lack of one. Robert had never asked Elena to sign a prenup. He'd been so in love, so certain of their future together. His attorneys had advised him to protect himself, but Robert had refused. He'd seen it as a lack of faith, a hedge against failure. Now that decision was destroying him. Elena's lawyers threatened to drag the case through courts for years. They'd subpoena business records, depose his colleagues, create a media circus that would damage NextGen Technology's reputation and shareholder value. They'd paint Robert as a cold, calculating businessman who'd used and discarded his wife. Robert's board of directors grew increasingly nervous. The stock price began to fluctuate. Shareholders questioned his leadership. Major clients expressed concerns about stability. Settle, his attorneys finally advised. Give her what she wants. It's not worth the cost of fighting. It's not about the money, Robert insisted. It's the principle. She betrayed me. She's trying to steal everything I built. His lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Chun who'd been practicing for 30 years, looked at him with something like pity. Mr. Castellano, principle is a luxury. Right now, you're bleeding money every day this continues. Your company is suffering. Your health is suffering. You look like you've aged 10 years in 10 months. Is proving a point worth losing everything anyway? Robert had no answer. In the end, he settled. Elena received $1.2 billion in cash and assets. The house, the art collection, properties in 3 states, investment portfolios, and most devastating of all, she received 20% of his shares in NextGen Technologies. Robert signed the papers with a hand that shook so badly he could barely hold the pen. He'd started with nothing and built an empire. Now he was giving half of it away to someone who'd stopped loving him years ago, if she'd ever loved him at all. When it was over, Robert sat alone in his attorney's conference room, staring at the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd lost, not just the battle, but something fundamental inside himself. His belief in love, his trust in people, his faith that hard work and good intentions mattered. Everything he'd built felt meaningless. After the divorce was finalized, Robert tried to return to normal. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity, believing that rebuilding his focus on NextGen Technologies would restore his sense of purpose. It didn't work. The 20% stake Elena now held gave her voting power in shareholder meetings. She'd allied herself with a faction of the board that had always questioned Robert's leadership style. The same board members who preferred aggressive profit maximization over Robert's more measured approach to growth and corporate responsibility. 6 months after the divorce, they made their move. A vote of no confidence. Robert had founded the company, but he no longer held majority control. The board voted to remove him as CEO, offering him a generous severance package and a seat on the board with significantly reduced power. Robert had 2 choices: accept the humiliation or fight a battle he would likely lose while destroying the company he'd built in the process. He accepted. The media loved the story. Billionaire CEO ousted from own company after costly divorce. The articles wrote themselves. Some portrayed Robert as a victim. Others suggested he'd lost his edge, become distracted, that his removal was justified by declining performance, which wasn't even true. Robert stopped reading the news. His days became a blur. He moved out of the house. Elena had gotten it in the settlement, and into a luxury apartment downtown. The space was beautiful and empty, much like his life. Friends from his business days reached out, but their sympathy felt hollow. They'd known him as powerful, successful, untouchable. Now he was a cautionary tale. Robert started drinking. Not excessively at first, just a scotch in the evening to help him sleep. Then 2. Then 3. Then he stopped counting. He'd wake up at 3 in the morning, the city lights casting strange shadows in his apartment, feeling utterly and completely alone. One night, drunk and despairing, Robert stood on his balcony on the 32nd floor and looked down at the street below. Cars moved like slow rivers of light. People walked to destinations that probably mattered to them. Robert wondered what it would feel like to step off the edge, to fall, to finally stop feeling this crushing weight in his chest. He stood there for an hour, his hands gripping the railing, genuinely considering it. What stopped him wasn't hope or faith or even self-preservation. It was a simple, almost funny thought. Elena would probably find a way to profit from his death somehow. Robert laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound, but it was something other than despair. He stepped back from the edge. The next morning, Robert looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Bloodshot eyes, gray skin, the haunted expression of someone who'd lost their way. He was still a wealthy man, even after the divorce and his ouster from Next-Gen Technologies. He had investments, real estate, enough money to live comfortably for multiple lifetimes. But none of it meant anything. Robert thought about his life, really thought about it for the first time in months. What had all his striving been for? What had building an empire actually given him? He'd had one period of genuine happiness, those early years with Elena, before everything soured. And those hadn't been about wealth or power. They'd been about connection, simplicity, presence. He'd been happiest when he had less. The realization was both liberating and devastating. Robert started liquidating assets. He sold his properties, his car collection, his investments. He kept enough to pay off some remaining obligations and settlements, then donated enormous sums to charities, education funds, housing initiatives, the kinds of causes Elena had once cared about. His accountant was horrified. "Mr. Castellano, you're giving away hundreds of millions of dollars. Are you sure about this?" "More sure than I've been about anything in years," Robert replied. He wasn't just divesting assets. He was divesting himself of the entire world that had failed him. The world of wealth and status, ambition and acquisition. The world that had promised fulfillment but delivered only emptiness. When he was done, Robert had approximately $57,000 to his name. To most people, that was still a significant sum. To a man who'd once been worth billions, it was nothing. And it felt right. Robert bought a reliable used truck. He gathered basic camping supplies, simple tools, some non-perishable food. He studied survival techniques, forest craft, the skills humans had relied on for thousands of years before civilization complicated everything. He thought about where to go. Somewhere remote. Somewhere he could disappear. Somewhere he could figure out how to be human again. The Olympic National Forest seemed right. Vast, largely uninhabited, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or achievement. Just trees and rivers and mountains that had existed long before Robert Castellano and would continue long after he was gone. On a gray morning in November, Robert loaded his truck and drove out of Seattle for the last time. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. There was no one to say goodbye to. As the city disappeared in his rearview mirror, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of peace. The drive took several hours. Robert navigated from highway to back roads to dirt tracks that barely deserved to be called roads. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. He parked his truck at the end of a logging road that hadn't been used in years. From here, he'd have to hike. He loaded a backpack with his essential supplies, the plastic sheeting he'd bought for shelter, rope, a basic toolkit, some canned goods, a water filter, matches, and a tarp. It wasn't much, but it was everything he needed. Robert hiked for 3 hours, following deer paths and his own instinct, moving deeper into the forest. He wanted distance from anything human. He wanted to be somewhere that his wealth, his company, his failed marriage didn't matter because they didn't exist. He found his spot as afternoon light filtered through the towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. A small clearing near a creek, protected by a natural rock formation on one side. The ground was relatively level. There were mature trees suitable for anchoring a shelter. It was perfect in its simplicity. Robert set down his pack and looked around at what would be his new home. No electricity, no running water, no internet or phone signal, no connection to the world that had broken him. Just trees, water, earth, and sky. For the first time in years, Robert felt something like calm. Robert had watched countless survival videos during his weeks of preparation. He'd studied shelter construction, waterproofing techniques, insulation strategies. But knowing something intellectually and doing it physically were very different things. The plastic sheeting was heavy, a large roll of clear, 6mm plastic designed for construction waterproofing. Robert had bought the thickest material available, knowing it would need to withstand rain, wind, and the weight of debris. He chose 4 trees that formed a rough rectangle, each about 15 feet from the others. This would give him approximately 225 square feet of covered space. Not large, but sufficient for one person. Robert began by tying rope to the first tree, about 7 feet up the trunk. His hands fumbled with the knots at first. He'd learned various knots from his research, but his fingers were soft, uncalloused, accustomed to keyboards rather than rope. It took him almost an hour to secure the first anchor point properly, then the second, then the third and fourth. By the time he'd created the basic framework, ropes forming a square perimeter above his head, the sun was lowering toward the horizon, and Robert's hands were raw and bleeding from rope burn. He didn't care. There was something deeply satisfying about the pain. It was real, immediate, connected to actual physical accomplishment rather than abstract financial metrics. Next came the plastic sheeting. Robert unrolled it carefully, draping it over his rope framework. The plastic was awkward and unwieldy, catching on branches, slipping from his grip. Multiple times, Robert had to start over, adjusting and readjusting until the sheeting hung properly. He used more rope to secure the plastic to the trees, creating tension that would keep the shelter taut and prevent water pooling. He overlapped sections of plastic where necessary, using small branches stripped of leaves as makeshift weights to hold everything in place. The walls came next. Robert wasn't trying to create something completely enclosed. He needed ventilation and wanted to maintain some connection to his surroundings. He left one side partially open, facing away from the prevailing wind direction, and used additional plastic to create 3 walls and most of a fourth. The roof required the most careful work. Robert angled it slightly, ensuring water would run off rather than collect. He reinforced the upper sections with extra rope, tying knots every few feet to distribute weight and prevent tearing. As darkness fell, Robert worked by moonlight and instinct. His body ached. His hands screamed in protest. Sweat soaked through his clothing despite the cool evening air. But slowly, methodically, his shelter took shape. By the time he finally stepped back to examine his work, it was after midnight. The shelter wasn't beautiful. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was solid, functional, and entirely his own creation. Robert ducked inside, sitting on the forest floor beneath his plastic roof. The material glowed faintly in the moonlight, creating a strange, ethereal atmosphere. He'd done it. He'd built himself a home with his own hands. Robert lay down on the ground, not bothering with his sleeping bag yet, and looked up at the plastic sheeting above him. Tomorrow he'd gather pine needles and moss for insulation. Tomorrow he'd reinforce weak points and create better drainage. Tomorrow he'd continue improving his shelter. But tonight, he was simply grateful to be here, in this place where his past didn't matter and his future was measured in practical tasks rather than profit margins. Robert woke at dawn, his body stiff and sore from sleeping on the ground. Every muscle protested as he crawled out of his shelter into the cool morning air. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling, small animals rustling through undergrowth, the distant murmur of the creek. Robert breathed deeply, filling his lungs with air that smelled of pine and earth and growing things. His first priority was fire. He'd brought matches, but Robert knew he needed to conserve them. Eventually, he learned to start fires through friction or other primitive methods. But for now, matches would have to do. Robert gathered materials methodically. First, tinder, the finest, driest materials that would catch easily from a spark. He collected dried grass, the papery bark from birch trees, and a bird's nest he found abandoned in a low bush. He separated the bird's nest carefully, creating a loose bundle of fine fibers. Next came kindling, small twigs and sticks, no thicker than a pencil, that would catch fire from the burning tinder. Robert snapped dead branches from lower parts of trees, selecting pieces that were dry and would burn cleanly. Finally, firewood, larger pieces that would sustain the fire once it was established. He gathered fallen branches, breaking them to more manageable sizes by propping them against trees and stomping down hard. The work was harder than he'd anticipated. Robert had to venture surprisingly far from his shelter to find enough dry wood, and carrying armloads back made his arms and shoulders burn with effort. By mid-morning, he had a substantial pile of materials organized by size. Robert cleared a space about 10 feet from his shelter, close enough for warmth and cooking, but far enough to minimize fire risk. He scraped away leaves and debris down to bare soil, creating a fire pit about 2 feet in diameter. He surrounded it with stones from the creek, building a basic ring to contain the fire. Now came the moment of truth. Robert arranged his tinder in the center of the pit, creating a small mound. He built a tiny teepee of the smallest kindling around it, leaving space for oxygen to flow. Around that, he built a larger structure of thicker kindling. He held his breath and struck a match. The first match blew out before it touched the tinder. Robert cursed, trying again. The second match stayed lit long enough for him to touch it to the dry grass. A small flame flickered, grew, and then died. Frustration rose in Robert's chest. This was supposed to be simple. He'd watched videos. He'd practiced in his apartment. Why wasn't it working? Because knowing and doing are different, he reminded himself. Because this is real. Robert rebuilt his tinder bundle, this time creating a slightly looser structure with more airflow. He struck another match, cupping it carefully against the slight breeze, and lowered it gently into the center of the tinder. The flame caught. The dried grass began to glow and smoke. Robert leaned down, blowing gently, steadily, providing oxygen to feed the growing fire. The tinder ignited fully, flames climbing into the kindling. The smallest twigs caught, then larger ones. The fire grew, crackling and popping, filling the air with smoke and warmth. Robert sat back, watching his fire burn, and felt an absurd sense of pride. He'd made fire. Human beings have been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years, but for Robert, in this moment, it felt like an incredible achievement. He fed larger pieces of wood into the flames, building the fire to a sustainable size. The heat felt wonderful against his skin. The smoke rose in a thin column through the trees, dissipating in the canopy above. Robert stared into the flames and felt something shift inside him. This was honest work, direct cause and effect. He'd gather materials, build a fire, and now he had warmth and the ability to cook food. No quarterly reports, no board meetings, no complex financial instruments. Just simple, ancient human competence. For the first time since his world had collapsed, Robert smiled. With fire established and shelter built, Robert's next concern was food. He brought canned goods and some basic supplies, but those would last only so long. If he was going to stay in the forest, and he had no intention of leaving, he needed to learn how to feed himself from the land. Robert had studied edible plants before coming here. He'd memorized identification guides, learned about poisonous lookalikes, understood basic foraging principles. But again, knowing and doing were different. He started exploring the area around his shelter in expanding circles, moving slowly, examining plants carefully. The forest floor was covered with vegetation, but most of it was unfamiliar. Robert forced himself to be patient, to observe rather than simply grab. After about an hour of searching, he found them. Wild strawberries. They grew in a sun-dappled clearing about 300 yards from his shelter, small plants with white flowers and tiny red berries. Robert recognized them immediately from his research. Wild strawberries were smaller than their cultivated cousins, but distinctly strawberry-shaped, with a characteristic seed-dotted exterior. He tasted one cautiously. It was intensely flavored, tart and sweet simultaneously, bursting with more taste than any strawberry he'd eaten in a restaurant. Robert spent the next 2 hours harvesting. He brought a small metal container for foraging, and he filled it with berries, working carefully to avoid damaging the plants. Sustainable harvesting, he'd learned, meant taking only what you needed and leaving enough for the plants to reproduce and for animals to eat. The work was tedious but meditative. Robert's mind quieted as he focused on the simple task of finding and picking berries. No thoughts of Elena, or the company, or what he'd lost. Just this The search, the find, the careful harvest. He also found other edibles. Miner's lettuce grew in shaded areas near the creek, small, tender leaves that were safe to eat raw. Fiddlehead ferns were past their prime season, but still present, their distinctive spiral shape unmistakable. Robert collected samples of each, moving slowly, triple-checking his identifications. The survival guides had been clear. When in doubt, don't eat it. A single mistake with plant identification could mean illness or death. By early afternoon, he'd gathered enough for a meal. It wasn't much, maybe 2 cups of strawberries, a handful of greens, but it represented something profound. Robert had fed himself from the forest. He'd found food that no one had planted, harvested, packaged, or sold. It had simply existed, waiting for someone with knowledge and patience to discover it. This was the opposite of his former life, where everything came through complex supply chains and financial transactions. Here, sustenance was direct, unmediated, real. Robert returned to his shelter, carrying his foraged goods. His fire had burned down to glowing coals, perfect for cooking. He brought a simple metal grill grate, the kind used for camping. Robert placed it over the fire pit, adjusting the rocks to hold it steady about 6 inches above the coals. First, he needed to clean his food. Robert walked to the creek with his metal container, rinsing the strawberries and greens in the cold, clear water. He examined each berry again, removing any that looked questionable. Back at the fire, Robert opened one of his canned goods, a simple can of beans. He brought proteins because foraging would primarily provide fruits, vegetables, and greens. He'd need to learn hunting or fishing eventually, but for now, he'd supplement with what he'd brought. Robert poured the beans into a small pot and set it on the grill grate. As they heated, he arranged the fiddlehead ferns and miner's lettuce on the grate as well, letting them cook slightly, wilting the greens and softening the ferns. The strawberries he kept raw. They were perfect as they were. The smell of cooking food filled the clearing. Robert's stomach growled loudly. He'd been eating less these past few days, adjusting to his new life, and now hunger hit him with surprising intensity. He watched the food cook, tending the fire to maintain the right temperature, using a fork to turn the vegetables. It was simple cooking, primitive even, but Robert found himself completely absorbed in the process. The beans bubbled gently. The greens wilted to a perfect tenderness. The ferns softened just enough while retaining some of their structural integrity. When everything was ready, Robert transferred the food to a metal plate. He arranged it carefully, the beans in one section, the cooked greens beside them, the fiddlehead ferns artfully placed, and the fresh strawberries on the side like a garnish. He sat on a fallen log near his fire and looked at his meal. It wasn't much. In his former life, Robert had eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants around the world. He'd had meals that cost thousands of dollars, prepared by celebrity chefs, paired with wines older than he was. This meal, beans from a can, foraged greens, and wild strawberries, had cost him maybe $3 in supplies and several hours of work. And it was the most beautiful meal he'd ever seen. Robert took his first bite. The beans were simple, slightly smoky from a fire. The miner's lettuce was tender with a mild, fresh flavor. The fiddlehead ferns had a unique taste, slightly nutty, completely unlike anything he'd eaten before. And the strawberries, those tiny, intensely flavored wild strawberries, exploded with sweetness on his tongue. Robert ate slowly, savoring each bite. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or reviewing documents or having a business conversation. He was just eating, fully present with the food and the experience. When was the last time he'd done that? Really tasted his food? Really appreciated the simple act of nourishment? He couldn't remember. As he ate, Robert watched the forest around him. A squirrel scampered up a nearby tree. Birds flitted through the canopy above. The creek babbled its endless song. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like whispered secrets. Robert finished his meal and set the plate aside. His stomach was full, not stuffed but satisfied. He'd eaten exactly what he needed, nothing more. He thought about all the elaborate meals he'd consumed in his old life. The excess, the waste, the food he'd barely tasted because he was distracted by deals and discussions. He'd treated eating as fuel, a necessary inconvenience between meetings. Here, with this simple meal he'd partially foraged himself, cooked over a fire he'd built with his own hands, eating in the forest that was now his home. Here, eating was sacred. It was connection. It was gratitude. Robert looked up at the sky, visible through gaps in the tree canopy. Clouds moved slowly across patches of blue. The afternoon was advancing toward evening. "Thank you," Robert said quietly, not sure who or what he was thanking. The forest, maybe the universe, the strawberries themselves. It didn't matter. Gratitude didn't need a specific recipient. It just needed to be felt and expressed. After cleaning his dishes in the creek and banking his fire for the evening, Robert sat outside his shelter and simply existed. The forest was entering that magical transition between day and night when the light becomes golden and everything seems to glow from within. The temperature was dropping, but Robert's fire provided warmth, and he'd put on an extra layer of clothing. He thought about his journey to this moment. From a museum where he'd met Elena, through the marriage and its dissolution, through the loss of his company and his decision to abandon everything. It all seemed like a story that had happened to someone else. Who was Robert Castellano now? Not a CEO, not a billionaire, not a husband. Just a man sitting in a forest, his hands blistered from rope and work, his body tired from physical labor, his stomach full of foraged food. Robert examined his hands in the fading light. They'd been soft once, manicured, the hands of someone who signed papers and shook hands in boardrooms. Now they were rough, dirty, with fresh blisters and healing scrapes. They were becoming the hands of someone who built things, gathered things, survived. He thought about Elena. Surprisingly, the thought didn't hurt as much as it once had. The betrayal, the divorce, the loss. It had all seemed catastrophic at the time. The end of his world. But maybe it had been the end of a world that needed to end. A world built on false foundations. A world where worth was measured in dollars, and success meant accumulation, and happiness was always somewhere in the future, depending on the next deal, the next milestone, the next achievement. Here, worth was measured differently. Could you build shelter? Could you make fire? Could you find food? Could you survive another day? These were honest measures. Ancient measures. Measures that cut through all the complicated abstractions of modern life and got to something fundamental. Robert had owned billions of dollars worth of assets. But could he build a fire? A year ago, the answer would have been no. Now he could. And that felt more valuable than any number in a bank account. The sky was darkening, stars beginning to emerge. Robert added more wood to his fire, watching sparks spiral upward into the night. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called. Another answered. Robert thought about his future. He had enough money in his truck, parked miles away, to last for months if he was careful. Eventually, he needed to make decisions. But not tonight. Not tomorrow. Maybe not for a long time. For now, he was here. He was alive. He was learning to be human in a way he'd never been before. And that was enough. Days turned into weeks. Robert lost track of time, and it didn't matter. He marked the passage of days by the sun's movement, by his growing competence, by the subtle changes in the forest around him. His shelter improved. He'd added layers of pine needles between double walls of plastic sheeting, creating insulation. He'd dug a shallow trench around the perimeter to direct rainwater away. He'd created a raised sleeping platform using branches and more plastic, keeping himself off the cold ground. His fire-building skills became second nature. He could now start a fire in minutes, even in damp conditions. He built a small smokehouse using stones and more plastic, where he could preserve food if he managed to catch fish or trap small game. His foraging expanded. He found edible mushrooms, carefully identified and triple-checked before consuming. He discovered patches of wild onions, watercress growing in the creek, hazelnuts from trees at the edge of his territory. He learned which roots were edible, which berries were safe, which plants could be used for medicine. Robert's body changed. The softness of his former life melted away. His muscles became lean and defined from constant physical work. His skin darkened from sun exposure. His hands developed thick calluses. His mind changed too. The constant churning anxiety that had been his companion for decades began to quiet. Robert found himself able to sit for hours, just observing the forest, not thinking about anything in particular. His sleep improved, deep, dreamless sleep that left him refreshed rather than exhausted. The forest revealed itself to him gradually. He learned to recognize individual trees, to know where certain animals nested or burrowed, to predict weather by the behavior of birds and the smell of the air. He understood now why indigenous peoples had lived this way for thousands of years. There was a rightness to it, a harmony. Robert still thought about his former life, but with increasing detachment. It was like remembering a movie he'd once watched. Interesting, but not particularly relevant to his current existence. Elena was getting married again, he assumed. Probably to Marcus, or someone equally wealthy. She'd be planning an elaborate wedding, wearing an expensive dress, inviting Seattle's elite. Robert hoped she'd be happy, and surprisingly, he meant it. She'd wanted a different life than the one he could give her. That wasn't malice. It was just incompatibility. Next-gen Technologies was probably thriving under new leadership, or struggling, or being acquired by a larger company. Robert didn't know, and he found he didn't care. He'd poured his life into building that company, but had been building on sand. It had given him wealth, but not wisdom, success, but not satisfaction. What he was doing now, this simple existence in the forest, this was real in a way nothing else had ever been. Robert developed routines that structured his days. He woke with the sun. First task, rebuild the fire from last night's coals. Second task, boil water from the creek for drinking. Third task, prepare and eat a simple breakfast. Fourth task, assess what needed to be done that day. Gathering firewood, foraging, repairing shelter, improving his camp. The work was never finished, but that was the point. There was always something to do, some way to improve his situation, some new skill to learn. But unlike his corporate life, where urgency was artificial and deadlines were arbitrary, here the work had natural rhythms and organic priorities. One morning, Robert realized he was happy. Not the frantic, anxious happiness of closing a big deal. Not the temporary pleasure of buying something expensive. Not the desperate, grasping happiness of trying to fix his failing marriage. Just contentment, peace, a deep satisfaction with the present moment that didn't depend on anything being different than it was. He was sitting by his fire, drinking hot water infused with pine needles, a simple tea that tasted of the forest, watching the morning mist rise from the creek. A deer had walked past his shelter earlier, pausing to look at him with curious, unafraid eyes before continuing on her way. Robert had nothing. He owned almost nothing. He'd lost everything that society said mattered. And he was happy. The realization made him laugh out loud, the sound startling a nearby bird into flight. How many self-help books had he read in his former life? How many seminars on peak performance, optimal living, achieving your best self? How many productivity apps, life coaches, meditation retreats, all promising to unlock the secret to happiness? And the answer had been this simple. Let go. Stop striving. Stop accumulating. Stop trying to control everything. Just be. Robert thought about all the men and women he'd known in the business world. Brilliant, accomplished people who were utterly miserable, who worked themselves to exhaustion chasing promotions they didn't need, who destroyed their health and relationships in pursuit of wealth they'd never have time to enjoy, who measured their worth by their net worth and found themselves perpetually inadequate because there was always someone richer, more successful, more powerful. He'd been one of them. And now he understood that they were all running from the same thing. The terrifying simplicity of just being alive, just being human, without all the elaborate distractions of achievement and acquisition. As evening approached on what Robert thought might be his 40th or 50th day in the forest, he'd lost exact count and didn't care. He prepared his evening meal. More foraged greens. Some wild mushrooms he'd found that morning. A fish he'd caught in the creek using a primitive spear he'd fashioned from a straight branch. His first successful catch after dozens of failures. He'd cleaned the fish carefully, grateful for its life, grateful for the nourishment it would provide. He cooked everything over his fire, taking his time, not rushing. The fish sizzled on the grill grate, its skin crisping beautifully. The mushrooms released their earthy aroma. The greens wilted to perfect tenderness. Robert plated his food and sat on his favorite log, the one that had become his evening perch. From here, he could see the creek, the surrounding forest, and through a gap in the trees, a small slice of sky that would soon fill with stars. He ate slowly, tasting everything, grateful for everything. The fish was delicious, simple, clean-tasting, completely unlike the elaborate seafood dishes he'd eaten in expensive restaurants. This fish had been alive this morning, swimming in the creek. Now it was nourishing his body. The circle felt sacred. When he finished eating, Robert cleaned his plate and utensils in the creek. The water was cold enough to make his hands ache, but he didn't mind. He returned to his shelter and added wood to the fire, building it up for the evening. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. Robert watched the display, completely absorbed. He'd seen thousands of sunsets in his life, but how many had he actually witnessed? Really looked at? Really appreciated? Tonight, he saw everything. The way the light filtered through the trees. The way shadows lengthened and merged. The way the entire forest seemed to hold its breath in that liminal moment between day and night. As darkness fell, Robert's fire became a small sphere of warmth and light in the vast darkness of the forest. The stars emerged, brilliant in a way they never were in the city, uncountable points of light that made Robert feel both infinitely small and perfectly connected to something larger. He thought about tomorrow. He needed more firewood. He wanted to explore a new section of forest to the north. He should check his shelter for any damage from last night's rain. But those were thoughts for tomorrow. Tonight was for simply being here, alive, present. Robert lay down on his sleeping platform, comfortable despite its simplicity. Through gaps in his plastic sheeting, he could see stars. The fire crackled gently. The creek provided its constant, soothing background music. An owl called somewhere in the darkness. Robert woke in the night, though he wasn't sure what had woken him. Not a sound or a movement. Something internal, some quiet shift in his consciousness. He lay on his sleeping platform, looking up at the stars visible through his shelter. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting a faint red light. Robert felt complete. That was the word. Complete. Not fulfilled in the sense of having achieved something or reached a goal. Complete in the sense that he'd found what he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching. Complete in the sense that he'd become who he was always meant to be. He thought about his life, all of it from beginning to this moment. The ambition and the achievements. The love and the loss. The wealth and its ultimate meaninglessness. The painful lessons that had brought him to this forest. It had all been necessary. Even the painful parts, especially the painful parts. Elena's betrayal, the divorce, losing his company. These hadn't been tragedies. They'd been liberation. They'd freed him from a life that was slowly killing him, even as it made him rich. Robert felt profound gratitude for everything that had happened, good and bad. It had all brought him here, to this shelter in this forest, to this moment of perfect peace. He thought about what came next. He could stay here indefinitely. He had the skills now to survive through winter, though it would be challenging. He could live this simple life for years, decades even, until age or accident or illness took him. Or he could return to civilization, take his remaining money, start something small and meaningful. A simple life, but one connected to other people. Maybe teaching survival skills. Maybe working with troubled young men who needed to learn what he'd learned. Maybe just living quietly somewhere, being a regular person with a regular life. Both paths seemed acceptable. Both had merit. But as Robert lay there in the darkness, he realized something. He was tired. Not physically tired. His body was stronger than it had been in years. But tired in his soul. Tired of striving, even the simple striving of survival. Tired of doing. Ready to simply be, completely and finally. The forest would continue without him. The creek would flow. The deer would browse. The trees would grow. The stars would wheel through their ancient patterns. His presence or absence made no difference to the vast, indifferent, beautiful universe. And that was okay. More than okay. It was perfect. Robert closed his eyes and smiled. He felt no fear, no regret, no sense of unfinished business. He'd built a fire one last time. He'd eaten one last meal. He'd watched one last sunset. He'd felt gratitude and peace. What more could anyone ask for? Morning came slowly, light filtering through the trees, birds beginning their dawn chorus. Robert woke, feeling serene. He performed his morning routine one final time, rekindling the fire from last night's coals, boiling water, preparing a simple breakfast of forage berries and some remaining trail mix. He ate slowly, savoring everything. The tartness of the berries, the crunch of nuts, the warmth of the morning sun on his face, the smell of the forest coming alive. After breakfast, Robert cleaned his few dishes and sat by his fire. He thought about leaving a note, some message explaining his choices, but decided against it. Words would only complicate something that was beautifully simple. He'd come to the forest to escape. He'd found something better, not escape, but arrival. He'd arrived at understanding, at peace, at acceptance. Robert Castellano had been a billionaire CEO. He'd built an empire. He'd loved and lost. He'd fallen from grace and walked away from everything. And in the end, in this forest, with nothing but a plastic shelter and a fire and the clothes on his back, he'd found what he'd been looking for his entire life. Enough. He had enough. He was enough. This moment was enough. The fire crackled. The creek babbled. Berçant. The forest lived its ancient, indifferent life. Robert closed his eyes and leaned back against a tree, feeling the rough bark against his spine, feeling the warmth of the sun, feeling the gentle breeze on his skin. He thought about nothing in particular. His mind was quiet, finally, after decades of noise. In the distance, he could hear the forest continuing, life feeding on life, growth and decay, the endless cycle that he was part of, had always been part of, would always be part of. Robert smiled. He'd lost everything and gained something immeasurably more valuable. He'd lost his fortune. He'd lost his company. He'd lost his wife. He'd lost his identity as a successful man. And in return, he'd found peace. He left the rest to God, to the universe, to the forest itself. Whatever came next, he was ready. More than ready. He was grateful. What is success? What does it mean to have enough? What makes a life well lived? Robert Castellano's story doesn't have a neat ending because life rarely does. He came to the forest broken and left, in whatever way he left, whole. Some would say he wasted his potential, threw away his gifts, gave up. Others would say he found something most people search for their entire lives and never discover. True peace. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps neither matters. What matters is that in losing everything, Robert found the one thing that can't be taken away, can't be divided in a divorce settlement, can't be voted away by a board of directors. His essential self. His humanity. His capacity for presence and gratitude. We live in a world that tells us we never have enough. That we must always be achieving, acquiring, advancing. That our worth is measured by our wealth, our status, our accomplishments. That happiness is always just beyond the next milestone, the next purchase, the next success. Robert's story asks us to question those assumptions. To ask ourselves, what do we really need? What really matters? What would remain if everything else was stripped away? The forest where Robert built his shelter still stands. The creek still flows. The strawberries still grow in sun-dappled clearings. The stars still wheel overhead in their ancient dance. And somewhere, in a way we may never fully understand, Robert found his answer. Not in a boardroom or a mansion or a bank account, but in a plastic shelter in the woods, with blistered hands and a full heart and a finally quiet mind. Maybe that's all any of us are searching for. Permission to stop. To be enough as we are. To find peace not in acquiring, but in releasing. Not in addition, but in subtraction. Robert Castellano built an empire and walked away from it. He had billions and gave them up. He came to the forest with almost nothing and found he had everything he needed. In the end, he left the rest to God. And perhaps that's the wisest thing any of us can do. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us what you've learned from Robert's story, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to your loved ones. Thank you.